people, the headlines, the issues impacting you and your family. This Week in Cincinnati on WCPO 9.
Hello and welcome to This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Craig McKee. Presidential elections are always historic, but this one will no doubt have a special place in the history books. As we record this Thursday afternoon, it still wasn't perfectly clear whether President Trump or former Vice President Joe Biden would win. But no matter who lives in the White House for the next 4 years, the shock waves from this election season will continue to reverberate. To look deeper now into that issue, I spoke with Professor Mark Caleb Smith from Cedarville University at my home studio. All right, Professor Mark Caleb Smith from Cedarville University. Political science is your game. This is kind of your Super Bowl, isn't it, when it comes to the presidential election?
It is, but kind of like a regular Super Bowl, you're always expectant, and then at some level, you're happy when it's over.
Let's talk about this. As we record this right now, on Thursday, there is no decision in the presidential race. By the time this airs, there could be a decision, or they could still be doing possibly recounts or trying to deal with legal issues. Those are things we just don't know at the time right now when we're doing this interview. But looking at the numbers, obviously we are looking at a record turnout. To me, that speaks volumes on many levels. What does it say to you?
There's an awful lot of enthusiasm in the electorate for this campaign. I think it'd probably be a mistake to say there's enthusiasm necessarily for one side or the other. There's an awful lot of enthusiasm against the other side. And so I think an awful lot of Biden supporters are really there to vote against President Trump. And at some level, there's a fair number of Trump supporters that were really afraid of what might happen in a Biden administration. But however you slice it, an awful lot of voters, probably more voter turnout than we've had since 1900.
In some instances here, in certain races, certain states, you're looking at, 8,000 vote difference as the tallies are still coming in at this point, 8,000 or 10,000. I mean, some of these margins are really, really tight, which really leads to that whole really divided country. And granted, we've seen close races in the past, but something that's come out of this particular cycle is, and we see this at kind of the down the line races, you had some people who were Republicans who went ahead and voted for Biden, but then voted and stuck to the Republican ticket down the rest of the ballot.
Yeah, it looks like there are a fair number of Republican voters who are perfectly happy to vote for Republican members of Congress, for senators, for House members, who are generally outperforming the president in some key states. And so, but then they either voted third party maybe for the presidential ticket, or maybe they voted for Joe Biden. So a good bit of strategic voting. At some level, if Mr. Biden wins this thing, there's going to be some level of Republican, I think, relief, because if they hold on to the Senate, then they sort of see that as a check on a Biden administration. So for them, I think for a fair number of Trump supporters, they're not all that worried about the outcome at this point.
When we look at the effects of this race, and we heard Rahm Emanuel and Chris Christie, who were part of the ABC News panel, on election night and the days since then, they were talking about the one positive that has really come out of this is that, the president kept his base throughout and really got them to the polls. And obviously you have other people that either attached themselves who didn't vote for President Trump in the past, but then jumped on and voted for him this time around. Obviously, and their conversation was kind of funny. They're already focused on 4 years down the road. Like, we haven't even called this race at this point during our conversation here. But their focus is, what does this do overall to our election system when, even 2 years down the road for the next election, or 4 years for the next presidential?
I think you first have to understand that in American politics, we've sort of taken elections and put them at the center of American politics. And I'm not sure that's always healthy. We should be worried often more about solving problems or looking at really systematic issues, as opposed to thinking about what's 2 years in the future, what's 4 years in the future, because then you're just always looking for that next election, as opposed to really thinking hard about what to do right now. But even if you take all that and you put all that aside, I think that it is going to have an effect. I mean, you can even see a rematch in 2024 between these two candidates. If Mr. Biden wins a close election, I don't see Donald Trump as the kind of person to just sort of slink into the background and disappear for 4 years. I could see him still holding rallies. I could see him having a network television show, for example. and still keeping himself in the mainstream, and then running again. And, given his amount of support within the Republican Party and a fair bit of allegiance of those supporters, then I think he would be a very credible candidate in 4 years. And so, yeah, it's an important election, but in some ways, I'm not sure it really has settled the issues. Like you said, it's a divided country right now. We're still divided. This election still feels a lot like 2016, even if we end up with a different person in the White House.
One thing that many Democrats were disappointed with on this race is that while it appears in some of the numbers here that Vice President Biden may end up being the next president, there wasn't really a shakeup down the Democratic ticket. Right. There weren't a lot of houses flipped, governorships, and things of that nature. There really wasn't a shakeup that I think they expected with the kind of campaign that the president or the vice president was pushing for this time.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's going to be a good bit of Democratic disappointment in this election, even if Biden pulls this out. They were really looking for a repudiation of Donald Trump. They wanted to see a massive social, cultural statement against Donald Trump and Trumpism. That has not happened. And we'll spend some time trying to figure out why maybe that hasn't happened. But, I think just speculating right now, the civil unrest that we saw throughout the summer, arguments to maybe defund the police and things like that, and maybe even packing the court here in the last month or two, that kind of rhetoric really gets a lot of people thinking, I'm not sure if I want people this progressive all up and down the ticket. And so, yeah, I think the Democrats maybe have themselves to blame a little bit for why they didn't make more of a really good opportunity with a vulnerable president, with a pandemic happening. They didn't make near the inroads that I would have expected.
The push for absentee ballots, clearly, as the counts have come in, more Democrats voted by absentee mail-in ballots than Republicans did. And we're seeing that as these counts are coming in, and there's been confusion. The general public who maybe didn't understand the process, that, we're so used to getting those results on election night, and now suddenly, well, where did these, 300,000 votes come from? This is a long process that we haven't really had to deal with for quite some time.
Yeah, a couple of things going on here. I mean, one, places like Ohio allowed those votes to be counted early, so that as soon as the Ohio polls closed, we saw a lot of numbers pop up that really looked good for Joe Biden. But as you said, the people who voted in person tended to be much more like Donald Trump. And so depending on how the state handled it, the early returns look different than the later returns. I think the other issue is the Democrats really made a strong effort to appeal uniquely to these mail-in voters, and they courted them and they worked to recruit them over these months, and it appears to be paying off pretty remarkably in some ways.
Well, some of the messaging, though, from the Republican Party was mixed, because you had on a lot of their flyers, their website, they encouraged mail-in ballots, they encouraged the absentee vote, but yet you had President Trump often on Twitter discouraging it, talking about how fraudulent it can be and the dangers of it. So that mixed messaging could have also impacted some of those Republican voters as well.
No, I agree with you. And I think if we take the president at his word, he just simply wanted to guarantee that his voters showed up. And for him, he felt better if they did it in person. If we want to take a more cynical approach, then casting doubt on the idea of mail-in voting ahead of time could sow the seeds for arguments about fraud and other things after the vote is actually tabulated. We're actually seeing some of that right now. And so the Trump campaign's filing lawsuits in Georgia and in Pennsylvania and in Nevada and other places, trying to argue that at some level these votes are being dealt with fraudulently. Now, right now, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that that's the case, but we just don't know. We're not on the ground. We don't see what's happening. But so far, they haven't been all that successful with their legal challenges. We'll see how it goes.
All right. Our conversation here with Professor Mark Caleb Smith of Cedarville University is going to continue right after this short break. Welcome back to This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Craig McKee here with Professor of Political Science Mark Caleb Smith with Cedarville University. Just before the break, we were talking about this concern among some voters, and we've seen it on both the left and right. We've seen demonstrators who are out there who are on favor the Democratic Party saying continue the count, continue the count. We've seen President Trump supporters saying continue the count, and in other locations saying stop the count. We've seen this divisiveness. The process itself is in place where the votes are cast, every vote gets counted. There's a process here, and stopping the vote, or again, depending on who you're listening to, stopping the vote and saying we're not going to count anymore, that's just not part of the process.
It's not, and it's never been part of the process. It just doesn't happen. The difference is that normally there's enough of a margin within a state level that those extra thousands of ballots just don't matter that much with the margin. But since we had so much mail-in voting and so much absentee voting, we are looking at hundreds of thousands of ballots that in many states really is a decisive number of ballots. And so we have to count them before even news organizations are willing to say it looks like this person's going to win or not. And so, yeah, we're used to getting this thing called on a Tuesday night. You and I are talking here on a Thursday. Who knows by the time this airs what's happened? But this is going to take a while, and we should be patient about it. And like you said, let the process play out. There's nothing wrong with counting votes. We should all agree, I would hope, that there's nothing wrong with counting votes. And so count all the votes that we can, make sure it's a fair process, and then we'll have results.
And all the results, obviously, all this is public information. So
Yes.
After the election is over, recounts, or if somebody wants to go and verify everything, they obviously can. When we look at the down the line ticket, Hamilton County Prosecutor Joe Deters, Republican, survived. Many other, judges, Republican leaning judges were ousted. And we saw this kind of push out.
Right.
In other parts of the country, we saw kind of mini blue walls. Some
Right.
people argued, Rahm Emanuel was arguing that actually there were two blue walls. But what did you really take out of what you saw play out on Tuesday night?
Yeah, for me, mostly a status quo election. It didn't really change all that much. It looks like the Republicans are going to hold on to the Senate. It looks like the Democrats will probably hold on to the South, or to the House. And depending on who wins the presidency, obviously that'll make a difference. But you don't see really massive groups switching from one side to the other. I think you did see Republicans do a bit better among Hispanics than they have done historically, a bit better amongst African Americans than they have done historically. But it really wasn't large enough numbers to say, you know what, this was a change election. This is the kind of election where we're going to see a historical moment taking place. It's also true that there are a lot of local issues driving this. And so depending on how urban areas, for example, dealt with unrest this summer, there could be a lot of residual hard feelings about what took place. There could be a lot of a movement to sort of hold people accountable through the vote process at those local levels that just wasn't showing up at the national level, for example. And so, that's one of the reasons why it's been said throughout our history that politics is a local business. Generally it is, but we have seen sort of in recent years, people taking that national level maybe even more seriously than the local level, which I think is always a mistake, frankly. But those local politics matter, and sometimes you saw some diverse results.
Well, obviously, politics are different now than they were in years past. Who knows what happens? 2 years from now, when members of Congress or what have you are running, and then we have the presidential election cycle again. Who knows what those candidates are going to mount from a campaign style? Are they going to take and embrace some of the tactics that President Trump has used and with great popularity, or will they kind of slide back to the way that campaigns used to be? We're just going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think we will. And it's going to be interesting to see whether Donald Trump is really just an anomaly. He could just be the weird guy that can do it this way that no one else can really do effectively. If other people begin to mimic his tactics and succeed with them, then you're going to see more and more people, I think, taking that on and trying to win. But it's just too early to tell. Like you said, in 2 years, 4 years, we'll have a better sense of where we are.
Absolutely. All right. Professor Mark Caleb Smith, Cedarville University, thank you so much for spending some time with us once again. And again, we have no idea at this point, since we're recording this on Thursday, what the outcome is, but I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Thank you very much. Welcome back to This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Craig McKee. Hamilton County made its own election history this week. Charmaine McGuffey was elected sheriff, defeating Bruce Hoffbauer. McGuffey spent 33 years serving in the ranks of the sheriff's office. She will be the first female and first lesbian sheriff in Hamilton County when she's sworn in early next year. Marielle Carbone has more on what her win means.
Today, McGuffey really honed in on those two factors, being a woman and being a lesbian, which she claims are part of the reason she was fired from her job here back in 2017, and also part of the reason why she decided to run in the first place. So this win really is a sort of redemption for her, and she says she'll plan to use some of those experiences to help direct her policy as sheriff. It's a morning of hugs for Charmaine McGuffey, Hamilton County's new sheriff-elect, who has a message to young women and girls.
When you hear the word no, you know that means go.
McGuffey shattered the glass ceiling with her win. She's the first woman and lesbian sheriff here and will use those experiences to lead the department.
I know what it feels like to be targeted, to be the only LGBT woman in the room.
In fact, it's partly why she jumped in the race. McGuffey was fired from her job as Major of Jails and Court Services in 2017. She says it was because she's openly gay and in retaliation for pointing out excessive use of force. She sued the sheriff's office in 2018 for discrimination. That case goes to trial on December 7th. She hopes her win as sheriff can create a cultural change.
What I've seen in my career is a system that does not allow diversity in the upper echelon and ranks of departments. And we need that here in Cincinnati.
McGuffey beat her opponent, Republican Bruce Hoffbauer, by nearly 20,000 votes. In a statement today, he said, "I wish Charmaine McGuffey luck. The people of Hamilton County deserve professionalism and leadership that keeps our neighborhood safe." And Tuesday, before the election, he told us a McGuffey win isn't the end for him.
My Gone Fishing sign is not hanging on my door, and I know I have more to offer.
I'm ready to move forward as your sheriff, and I am eager and ready to work.
And we've been saying all along, the reason this race is such a big deal is because of the power that the sheriff holds with overseeing an $80 million budget here in the county. McGuffey will start her new role coming up in the first week of January. Reporting from the Hamilton County Justice Center, Marielle Carbone, WCPO 9 News.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Craig McKee. You know, we are still a few weeks away from Thanksgiving. I can already smell the meal, right? But as people make plans to travel for the holidays, there is some serious concern about getting the coronavirus or unwittingly giving it to friends or family members you're gathering with. So how much do you have to worry about that? Reporter Raven Richard took a closer look for answers this week and shares a warning from an infectious disease professor.
Thanksgiving will no doubt look a little different this year for some families because of COVID-19. But it's those family gatherings that the medical community says they're worried about. Will we potentially see a rise in COVID-19 cases after Thanksgiving and Christmas?
I think that we can expect to see increases.
Dr. Carl Fichtenbaum, a professor of infectious diseases at the University of Cincinnati and UC Health, has very little doubt. Dr. Fichtenbaum says 80 to 90% of the population are still at risk for catching the disease. He also says at least 50% of the cases are asymptomatic.
A family member could have no symptoms, could be shedding virus.
My mom is in her 80s, and we want to keep her safe, and we will be masking. We have to be, but we're not going in her house.
Instead, Hamilton County Commissioner Denise Driehaus says she and her family will have their Thanksgiving in the garage with the door open. Next week, county commissioners are expected to make safe suggestions to folks for the holidays. Another alternative:
people would quarantine so that they were not around anyone else for 14 days before getting together with their family, and before they get together, that a day or two beforehand, that they would get tested.
And as cases rise in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky,
I don't think it's worthwhile to be playing Russian roulette with our families.
Reporting in Hamilton County, Raven Richard, WCPO 9 News.
As always, we'd love to hear your opinion about any of the stories you see on WCPO 9. Call the Feedback Friday hotline at 513-852-4998. I share your thoughts every Friday night at 6 o'clock. And that's going to do it for This Week in Cincinnati for this Sunday. Join us for breaking news, weather, and sports at 6 and 11 tonight on WCPO 9 News. Plus, we're always updating your headlines on WCPO.com.